So pioneer species are those first species that show up in an area that has been disturbed, destroyed. And these tend to be things that are small and fast growing. So in secondary succession, which is what we've mostly been talking about, crabgrass and dandelions and plantains and clovers, all these little tiny things that everybody would look at and say, oh, it's weeds. It's the stuff that you find growing up through the cracks in a parking lot. It's the stuff that you find growing up through the cracks in a tennis court. It's the stuff that you find growing up through cracks in old abandoned roads. Growing up the middle of your driveway, if you've got, the old two-wheel ruts driveway model going on. What grows up in the middle are usually pioneer species. They're the first things that come back in an area that's been disturbed. And they tend to be pretty tough stuff because they can grow in conditions that aren't optimal. They tend to be generalists. They tend to reproduce fast and grow fast because that's how they recolonize an area with living things. In a primary succession, it's different. In primary succession, there's really only one pioneer, and that's lichen. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So we'll talk briefly about primary successions. So what happens when we go ahead and let the biological community recover completely? Around here, what would it look like in 100 years? It's a forest. And if we took an area outside of Tucson, Arizona, and bulldozed it and let it go for 100 years, do you think it would look the same as it would here? No. What you get at the end of a secondary succession is called the climax community. It's the thing that recovers, and it depends on precipitation and temperature and latitude. And around here, yeah, you all know this intuitively. Let it go, it becomes forest. Everything turns back into forest. If you've ever been walking in the woods and seen old fence lines, that was a farm field. Let it go, it turns back into forest. It's amazing. The nature's capacity to recover, and not only to recover, but to cover over evidence of whatever it was that disturbed it in the first place, I find absolutely amazing. So the climax community is different in different locations on the planet. Now, you said it's forest. I want you to know this. This place that you are from, the forest we have here is actually a very special forest. And I'm not talking like special, like, fairy tale, pixie dust, gnomes living under tree roots or anything. The forest that we have here is called the Eastern Mixed Mesophytic Hardwood Forest. It's a mouthful. It's a mixed hardwood forest. And this mixed hardwood forest extends through most of Appalachia. We're, of course, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains here. We are considered Appalachian economically, and botanically, most of the species we have here would be considered species that exist in the Appalachians. Okay, so biologically, we're more or less Appalachian. Geologically, it's up for grabs, but whatever. The whole way up and down the Appalachian chain and into Ohio and a little bit out into the flatter parts of Virginia before you get into the real flatlands, we have this Eastern Mixed Mesophytic Hardwood Forest. And it is one of the, from a perspective of tree species, it is the most diverse forest there is. It is, from a perspective of tree species, it's more diverse than a rainforest. Now, from, total species richness, total species diversity, it doesn't hold a candle. But in terms of the kind of trees and the kind of tree associations we see, it's incredibly diverse. So, who here is good at tree ID out in the woods? Anybody cut firewood, and so you're good at bark ID? Okay. So you walk out into our woods, and you might see black cherry, and butternut, and walnut, and shagbark hickory, and kingnut hickory, and red oak, and white oak, and pin oak, and let's see, probably not black oak, but you might see sugar maple, and you might see red maple, and you might see silver maples if you're down along the floodplain, and you could see sycamores if you're down there too, and you might see hemlocks, and you might see white pines, and I could keep going. There is not another forest in the world like that. In most forest ecosystems, you have one or two dominant tree species. So there are oak forests, and they're largely comprised of a mixture of different types of oak trees. They look really boring to me, being from here. If you go up towards Lake Erie and you get into like Geauga County, you see what are called Maple Beach Association forests. And guess what kind of trees you find? Maples and beeches. And you don't see a whole lot of other tree species. So this is actually a really special kind of place. It's a cool forest. Biologists from other parts of the world are kind of astounded by our forests because they are so diverse in terms of the tree species that we see. It's kind of cool. So hey, be a little impressed with the place you're from. We got more tree species than anybody else. It's kind of neat. So you should go out in the woods, not in a blizzard, and enjoy all those tree species. But that's the climax community. That's the thing that it finally arrives back at. So, up to now, we have been talking about secondary succession, where there's soil and we just destroyed all the living things that were on top of that soil, and stuff's growing back. But here we're talking about primary succession, where there has never been soil before. So where does this happen? Where on earth do you not have soil? Where do you think? Volcanoes. Yeah. So, no, deserts actually have soils. Now, desert soils, like being, folks from Appalachian, Ohio, desert soils don't look much like soil to us. They're pretty sparse and sandy and nutrient poor, but they have soil. But in places, so underwater, here's the water, where you have a volcano that's erupting underwater, and eventually that magma breaks through, becomes lava, and you form a volcanic island. This is what Hawaii would have been like at one point. That initial island is just bare rock out in the middle of the ocean. That is a place where primary succession can occur. Now we also, if you scrape something all the way down to bedrock, there were these big ice cubes that came through Ohio about 10,000 years ago. Anybody familiar with those? The glaciers. It's why it's flat to the north and it rolls to the south, because the glaciers stopped right in the middle of Columbiana County. No kidding, they did. And there were places where those glaciers scraped all the soil off the rock, and they scraped it right straight down to bare rock. That would be a place where you would have primary succession, because there's no soil. This is slow. It takes, I can never remember if it's 100,000 years or 10 or a million years. Anyway, it takes a long time to build a single inch of topsoil. To build this little tiny amount of topsoil takes, let's say, a minimum of 100,000 years. It takes a long time. And these things, these lichen, I've got some lichen over here that were living on a tree branch. But these lichen that blow in to bare rock, they're spore-borne. So their spores blow in on the wind, and they settle on those areas of bare rock. And those lichen can attach to bare naked rock. And the cool part is, and you may have seen lichen growing on rocks, they actually secrete acid, and they break down the rocks. And there are some varieties of lichen that are edible, but in most cases you have to boil them first to remove the acids, to dilute them and remove them. Once they dissolve that rock, then you've got some mineral pieces. And then once those lichen die, they decompose. And so after, 100,000 years or so, you might build enough soil to have other plants take root. And then those other plants can send roots down into the rock and break it and crack it. And it's a long process. It's a really long process. Okay. That's pretty much what we're going to say about succession. This could be anywhere around here, couldn't it? This could be the view out your back door. Here's what I like about this. This shows 3 stages of succession. Actually, more than that, but 3 are right up front. So you see this area over here? Let me zoom in on it. Okay, so this right here, what plants does it look like are growing there to you? Grass. I'd say this was brush hog this year. Somebody ran a mower or a brush hog or something through there, And that's been cut, and really the only thing we see growing is grass. And this might be somebody's hayfield. I mean, it doesn't look all that diverse even for a hayfield. Usually you have some clover and stuff in there, but whatever. It's pretty much one species from the looks of it. This is probably what disturbed the biological community. But what's interesting is if we look right over at this section, does that look a little different? I'd say that didn't get cut this year. And you notice that the grass is a little taller, a little deader, and I see some other species starting to pop up in there. I'm guessing there's some dock. I'm guessing there might be an ironweed. It's hard to see what all of these are. There might be some mullein. I'm not sure. But we've definitely got some other species starting to creep in. Well, what's really cool, and some of you are probably quite familiar with some places that look like this. If we look over here, look at how different this area looks. We got goldenrod, we got aster. This probably hasn't been cut in 3 years. I would peg that at about 3 years. With that progression of goldenrod, we've got aster. I see thistle in there. I definitely see some ironweed back here. If we let it go another 3 years, we're going to see multiflora rose, we're going to see blackberries, we're going to see black raspberries, we're going to see a lot of brambles and bushes, we'll start to see autumn olives. It's going to get harder to walk through. It's going to get to a point where you couldn't reclaim it back to hayfield with just a lawnmower. You're going to need a serious brush hog. You're going to start to get young trees, you're going to start to get hawthorns and crab apples. It's going to change. And eventually, it's going to look like this. So I like that picture because of the fact that it shows so many stages of succession. It doesn't have sort of the middle ground between that goldenrod and the full forest, but you can kind of imagine it if you've driven around this area. And most of you have been riding around this area most of your lives. So, okay. Okay, so as I said, quiz is tomorrow, barring disaster, assuming we're all here and we're not snowed in at home. It'd be so sad. Study guides are there. And this whole unit, we've been talking about how communities, how pieces of the community affect one another. So what I have now is a piece from it's a radio show called Radio Lab, and they do a lot of like science shows, and it's nice because it's a 1-hour show, and they'll pick a topic and they'll do like 3 or 4 little mini segments on that topic. So they did one recently on the Galapagos Islands. And do you know what the Galapagos are? What are they? They're islands where Charles Darwin did a lot of his observational work that led him to develop his theory of biological evolution. And they're really diverse and really interesting, and they're also a big tourist mecca because of Darwin's association with them. So they have this intense biological community, and they have a lot of tourists. So we're going to listen to this Radio Lab article. While we are listening, what I want you to do is get out a piece of paper. You're going to summarize big ideas as we go. When you're done, you're going to turn that in for points. Okay? So we'll get started.